London, late 19th century. On a hill just outside the city, a strange palace rises. It looks like a fairy tale château in France, but it doesn't belong to a king. It is the Rothschilds' estate, Waddesdon Manor. And today we dive into the dark story behind the Rothschilds' Waddesdon Manor old money mansion. For most people, it's just a beautiful house with paintings and fountains. But behind these walls, there were deals the newspapers never wrote about, guests whose names never appeared in official records, and decisions that shaped the fate of entire countries. Here, the servants knew more than ministers, and family celebrations felt like secret councils. How did a family of bankers manage to build themselves such a royal court while remaining in the shadows? What price had to be paid for this glitter, and by whom? And most importantly, if the walls of Waddesdon Manor could speak, what dark truth about old money would they reveal? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The stories start with buildings, but buildings keep secrets better than people do. Stand in the grand entrance hall at Waddesdon Manor today. Look up. Gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers catching afternoon light through tall French windows. Visitors move slowly, phones raised, photographing Renaissance portraits, and Sèvres porcelain behind velvet ropes. Tour guides speak in hushed, reverent tones about Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild's exquisite taste. The air smells faintly of furniture polish and old silk. This is the story they want you to see. But walk that same hall backward through time. November, 1940. The chandeliers are dark. Heavy blackout curtains smother every window. Tape crosses the glass in X patterns, a crude shield against blast. Outside, searchlights rake the Buckinghamshire sky. Inside, the grand entrance hall is cold, empty. The portraits watch over rooms with no guests. In wartime, Waddesdon Manor became a shell, the family largely gone. The servants cut down to a skeleton staff, and in the basement strong rooms, packed in crates and wrapped in blankets, art treasures from London museums waited out the Blitz in secret storage. The National Gallery trusted this house with Rembrandts and Gainsboroughs when even some of Britain's own vaults felt too vulnerable. The same rooms, different worlds. That clash is what Waddesdon was built to absorb. A French Renaissance château dropped onto an English hilltop, a banker's fantasy palace, designed to whisper permanence and belonging. Yet it was raised by a family who, just a few generations earlier, had been banned from owning land in most of Europe simply because they were Jewish. The Rothschilds built Waddesdon to prove they had arrived, that they belonged among the landed gentry and the titled aristocracy, that their money had bought not only luxury, but something deeper: safety, acceptance, a future. They were wrong about the safety part. To understand Waddesdon Manor, you have to understand what it was really defending. Not just art, not just status, but something more fragile and more desperate: the hope that wealth could build walls high enough to keep out the hatred that had followed this family across borders and centuries. The belief that a perfect house on an English hill could finally give the Rothschilds what their banking empire never could: the right to simply exist without apology. The question that haunts every gilded room is this: what do you build when you know, deep down, that no fortress is permanent, when the ground beneath your castle has always been contested? Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild began construction on Waddesdon in 1874. The final stone was laid in 1889. 15 years to turn a vision into stone and slate. A French palace in the English countryside, meant to host princes and prime ministers, filled with art that kings envied, surrounded by gardens that rewrote the landscape itself. But even as the house climbed skyward, the foundations of the world beneath it were uncertain. This is not a story about a mansion. It is a story about what people build when they are trying to prove they deserve to exist, about the bargains struck between outsiders and the establishment, about servants who kept the machinery running while their employers entertained the powerful upstairs, about the gap between the glittering facade and the darker calculations behind closed doors. It is a story about old money, but not the simple fairy tale version. The complicated, morally ambiguous, sometimes brutal reality of what old money has to do to survive. The chandeliers at Waddesdon still shine, but if you know where to look, you can still trace the ghosts of tape marks on the windows. The boy who would build Waddesdon was not supposed to survive childhood. Ferdinand James Anselm de Rothschild was born in Paris in 1839, sickly from birth, pale, thin. The kind of child wealthy families watched over with private doctors, expensive tonics, and whispered consultations in corridors. His father, Anselm, ran the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt and Vienna. One uncle controlled the house in Paris. Another held London. The family business stretched across Europe, moving gold and government bonds through a web of blood ties and encrypted letters. Ferdinand's brothers were groomed for this empire. They were the strong ones, confident, expected to sit through long dinners with ministers and remember which cousin backed which railway and which government owed what to which branch of the family. Ferdinand was kept apart, protected, the fragile one. Being weak in a dynasty built on power teaches you things. It teaches you that you are always one illness away from being sidelined, that your worth can feel conditional, that you must prove yourself in ways your healthy brothers will never have to imagine. And it teaches you another survival skill. When the real world feels dangerous, you start building inner worlds you can control. Ferdinand was sent to England for his health. The damp English climate was supposed to be kinder to his lungs than harsh continental winters. An odd prescription, perhaps, but families in fear will believe what offers them hope. He arrived as a teenager, shy, foreign, his English uncertain, his role in the family's great machine undefined. Then he fell in love. Her name was Evelina, his cousin. The Rothschilds often married within the family. It kept the banking network tight, inheritances concentrated, secrets inside the clan. Evelina was 18. Ferdinand was 26. And this was more than a calculated alliance. Surviving letters between them hint at genuine affection, jokes, shared anxieties, plans for a shared life. They married in 1865. She died in childbirth 18 months later. The baby died as well. Here, the historical record falls almost silent. Victorian men did not easily write about grief, especially Rothschild men who were expected to steady empires and entertain royalty without visible cracks. But Ferdinand's choices speak louder than any diary. He stepped away from the family bank. He loosened his ties to Vienna and Frankfurt, to the financial machinery his brothers navigated with ease. He settled permanently in England and began to collect, obsessively, porcelain, paintings, furniture, manuscripts, objects he could catalog, control, and arrange into precise order, objects that would never abandon him. By his early 30s, Ferdinand had assembled a collection that could rival public institutions. His London house was overflowing, rooms turned into storage, staircases narrowed by crates. Every spare surface became a display. Yet collections like this demand more than walls. They demand a stage. They demand a setting that tells visitors how important these objects are. They demand a castle. The decision to build Waddesdon emerged in the early 1870s. Ferdinand would later write that he wanted a seat in the country worthy of his name and position. But beneath the polite phrasing, the psychology is clearer. He was designing a place where he could nail beauty into permanence, a house that would draw in the English aristocracy, who still saw the Rothschilds as foreign upstarts, Jewish, continental, too rich too quickly, and force them to acknowledge that this banking family understood elegance as deeply as any ancient house. He was shaping a monument to control in a life that had taught him how little could truly be controlled. The wound that drove Ferdinand did not show in photographs, no spectacular accident, no visible scars, but it marked every decision that followed. It guided the choice of French Renaissance style, the boldly impractical hilltop site, the relentless insistence on perfection in every room. The famous weekend house parties that would one day draw the Prince of Wales himself, the future Edward VII, to smoke cigars in Ferdinand's library and sleep in Ferdinand's guest rooms. See, the house seemed to say, "Look at what I have made. Look at what I deserve. Look how I belong." But belonging paid for with gold and architecture is never fully secure. And somewhere in Ferdinand's mind, shaped by childhood illness, sudden bereavement, and the knowledge that his family's place in Europe had always depended on the mood of others, lived a truth he could not quite voice. No matter how flawless the facade, the ground beneath it was never guaranteed. Not for a Rothschild, not in the 19th century, not ever. Still, he would try. The hill in Buckinghamshire was waiting. The hill was a problem. Ferdinand purchased the land near the village of Waddesdon in 1874, roughly 2,700 acres of Buckinghamshire countryside, rolling fields, ancient hedgerows, and at the center, a bare, windswept hilltop that no sensible architect would have chosen for a major construction project. The locals thought he was mad. Building on a hill meant everything had to be dragged upward, stone, timber, every brick and beam, thousands of tons of material fighting gravity on roads that did not yet exist. The nearest railway station sat miles away. The village of Waddesdon itself was tiny, unprepared for what was about to descend on it. When Ferdinand's agents started hiring laborers and placing enormous orders for supplies, the true scale of the plan became impossible to ignore. This was not simply a country house, it was an engineering campaign disguised as architecture. Ferdinand hired a French architect, Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, precisely because he wanted something that looked nothing like a traditional English estate. No polite Georgian symmetry, no calm classical proportions. He wanted a Loire Valley château, the kind of structure French nobles had built in the 16th century when they needed to prove something to their king. The irony was obvious to everyone. A Jewish banker hiring a French architect to build a French palace in England to impress the English aristocracy. But Ferdinand understood symbols better than most. If you cannot be born into old European elegance, you can at least buy its blueprints and reassemble them, stone by stone, on foreign soil. The real work began in earnest in 1877. First came the hill itself. The bare summit had to be reshaped, leveled, and prepared for foundations that could carry a weight the land had never borne before. Steam engines were hauled in to power the excavation. Workers dug down to bedrock in places, then raised massive retaining walls to hold the altered terrain in place. Then came the approach. Ferdinand commissioned a winding drive that climbed the hill in curves, revealing the house in stages as carriages ascended. The road was not just practical, it was theater. You were meant to feel anticipation rise with every turn. Later visitors would describe the journey as breathtaking, which was exactly what the design intended. Slowly, the house emerged from plans into reality. Pale stone arrived from Bath. Slate for the roof came from Wales. Ornamental carvings were entrusted to craftsmen brought in from France. A central tower, wings stretching east and west, dozens upon dozens of windows, tall, multi-paned, designed to flood the interiors with light in a way most English country houses never attempted. But there was one part of Waddesdon the guests almost never saw: the basement. Beneath the gilded reception rooms and portrait galleries lay a hidden maze of servant corridors and service spaces, kitchens, sculleries, storage vaults, laundries, wine cellars, an entire underground infrastructure built to keep the great house functioning while remaining effectively invisible. The servants' wing was physically and socially separated from the world upstairs. Staff entered through different doors, used different staircases, moved along carefully planned routes that ensured they would not cross paths with family or guests unless summoned. None of this was unusual for the era. Every great house drew a hard line between above and below. But the scale at Waddesdon pushed that system to an extreme. Ferdinand employed dozens of staff, and once the estate was fully operational, the number would rise to well over 100. Each person had a defined role: footmen, maids, cooks, grooms, gardeners. And each understood that the effortless magic upstairs, the perfectly timed courses, the blazing fires, the spotless rooms, depended on them staying out of sight. The house was designed to broadcast taste and refinement, yet beneath that display it functioned like a precision factory. Every dinner party required hours of planning and preparation. Every weekend, gathering demanded logistics that bordered on military. The servants knew it. The family knew it. The guests pretended not to. This was the bargain of old money architecture. You built something beautiful enough to argue that you belonged, and you built it on the labor of people who would never be allowed to belong in the rooms they maintained. By 1883, the main structure was complete. Ferdinand moved in before the interiors were entirely finished, unable, or unwilling, to wait any longer. The French palace on the English hilltop was no longer a vision on paper. It was stone and glass and slate, visible for miles, dominating the landscape exactly as Ferdinand had imagined. The locals stopped calling him mad. They started calling him barren. But the performance was only beginning. A house is just a shell without the people who animate it. And Ferdinand was about to invite the most powerful figures in England to see with their own eyes what a Rothschild could build. The house was ready. Now it had to perform. Ferdinand understood that Waddesdon was not simply a residence. It was a stage. And the production he was mounting needed the right audience. Not just wealthy acquaintances, not just fellow bankers or distant cousins. He needed the people whose presence would confirm everything the house was built to say. He needed royalty. The Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, first visited Waddesdon in the 1880s. The exact date blurs in the historical record, but the meaning was unmistakable. The heir to the British throne, sleeping under a Rothschild roof, eating at a Rothschild table, smoking Rothschild cigars in a smoking room created with moments like this in mind. This looked like acceptance, or at least the costume of it. The weekend house parties at Waddesdon quickly became famous. Invitations were hunted, compared, bragged about. Guests arrived in private railway carriages at the local station, then transferred into Ferdinand's own carriages for the final ascent. The climb up the winding drive was choreographed to build tension, trees opening to framed glimpses of stone and towers, the château revealing itself piece by piece, swelling with every turn until it dominated the horizon. Inside, every detail had been engineered for effect. Electric lighting, still a novelty in many English homes, poured warm light over the reception rooms. An advanced heating system kept the building comfortable even in deep winter. Hot water waited in guest bedrooms, a luxury some older aristocratic houses still did not manage consistently. Ferdinand had studied what the British elite prized, and then met it with something a little more polished, a little more modern, a little more impressive. The weekend rhythm settled into a pattern: Friday arrivals and polite introductions. Saturday shooting parties across the estate. Ferdinand had ensured the grounds were well stocked with game birds for exactly this purpose. Afternoon tea in the drawing rooms. Dinners that could stretch to 12 courses, each dish served with quiet precision. Afterward, the traditional separation, men drifting to the smoking room, women to the drawing room, before the groups came together again for cards, music, or conversation that ran late into the night. But the important work rarely happened at the dining table. It took shape in corners, in low-voiced exchanges between courses. In the library after midnight, when most guests had gone upstairs, and a small circle of men remained with brandy glasses in hand, murmuring about government loans, colonial railways, and concessions in countries most people could not even point to on a map. Ferdinand did not officially turn these weekends into banking conferences. He had stepped away from daily financial operations. Yet he was still a Rothschild. His brothers and cousins still ran the family houses in London, Paris, Vienna, and beyond. When ministers needed funds for national projects, when investors wanted reliable information about foreign markets, when delicate deals required confidentiality, those needs did not vanish at the front door of Waddesdon. They simply moved into more discreet spaces. Introductions could be arranged, names exchanged. Trust built slowly over cigars, carefully planned menus, and the unspoken understanding that any man capable of creating Waddesdon was plugged into serious capital. The British aristocracy came. They praised the food. They admired the art. They marveled at the technology. Then they went home and made jokes. The satirical magazine Punch published ruthless cartoons. Rothschild figures appeared with exaggerated noses, clinging to sacks of money, surrounded by symbols of greed. The caricatures blended envy with ridicule. Yes, the Rothschilds possessed astonishing wealth, but they were still treated as outsiders, foreign, Jewish, too rich, too fast. No matter how flawless their French château or how glittering their guest list, they were still, in the eyes of many, not truly English. Ferdinand saw the cartoons, heard the drawing room quips about Jewish millionaires trying to purchase their way into the landed class. He kept his reactions private. What could he have said publicly that would not deepen the sting? Protesting would only prove that the barbs had hit home. So he responded in the only way he believed might work. He escalated. More art, more guests, more precision. If the house was whispered about as too extravagant, he made it more dazzling. If his hospitality was dismissed as excessive, he made it meticulous. The counter to exclusion was to become so successful, so indispensable to the social fabric, that ignoring him would look ridiculous. And in many ways, the strategy worked. The Prince of Wales kept returning. Other royals followed. Cabinet members, diplomats, foreign dignitaries joined the guest lists. Waddesdon shifted from curiosity to fixture. Chichikik, an expected stop on the circuit for anyone who mattered in that world. Yet late at night, when the last carriage lamps had vanished down the drive and the servants had cleared the final glasses, Ferdinand sometimes walked the house alone. Past the portraits he had rescued and purchased, through rooms furnished with pieces that once belonged to French royalty, standing inside a chateau that had cost a fortune and taken 15 years to bring from idea to reality. The performance was impeccable. The audience applauded. The social calendar confirmed his success, but one question lingered beneath the applause. Was he safe yet? Had this finally been enough? The honest answer, the one he could never quite shake, was always the same. Not yet. Not entirely. So the weekends continued. The trains kept arriving. The rooms stayed full. And Ferdinand kept proving again and again that he belonged in a world still deciding whether it would ever fully let him in. Ferdinand died in 1898. He was 58. He never remarried after Evelina, never had children. The house he had spent 15 years building and roughly 2 more decades perfecting. The castle meant to declare permanence, to prove belonging, to secure a Rothschild future in England, suddenly had no direct heir. This was the flaw in using architecture as proof of stability. Buildings outlive their makers. And when the maker dies without children, all those carefully placed stones turn into someone else's responsibility. The inheritance moved sideways, first to Ferdinand's sister, Alice, then, after her death in 1922, to her son, James. The house stayed within the family, but the emotional blueprint shifted. Ferdinand had created Waddesdon as an extension of his own story, his taste, his grief, his desperate need to be accepted. His successors inherited the masonry, but not the wound that had driven him to stack it on a hill in the first place. For them, Waddesdon was simply a very large, very expensive house. James maintained it. He hosted guests. He kept adding to the collections. But something fundamental had changed. The château that was supposed to embody arrival and safety started to feel more like a museum to its founder. The rooms turned into stage sets for a performance whose original meaning was slowly fading from memory. And beyond the estate walls, Europe was shifting in ways that made Ferdinand's dream look increasingly fragile. In the late 19th century, the Rothschilds had reached the height of their power. 5 branches across 5 capitals, London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples, moved money and information faster than most governments could. They financed railways, underwrote wars, helped fund the British purchase of the Suez Canal. Their name became shorthand for international finance itself. That same visibility made them perfect targets. Anti-Semitism, never far from the surface in European life, grew louder and more organized. It stopped being just drawing room prejudice or casual exclusion and hardened into programs and platforms. Political parties were built around it. Newspapers printed elaborate conspiracy theories about Rothschild control of cabinets and markets. A notorious forgery, the so-called protocols, circulated widely, claiming to expose Jewish plans for world domination. The Rothschilds were mentioned by name again and again. Their wealth and cross-border reach, the very things that had made them indispensable, were rebranded as evidence of sinister influence. To anti-Semites, the combination of being Jewish and successful turned them into symbols for every anxiety about modern finance, capitalism, and social change. From Buckinghamshire, Waddesdon looked untouchable. The English countryside felt distant from the fever of the continent. England, people told themselves, was different, more stable, more tolerant. The Prince of Wales had visited. The family had been woven, cautiously, conditionally, but still woven, into British high society. Letters from relatives on the continent told another story. They spoke of new rules, restrictions on where Jews could live, quotas limiting what professions they could enter, political movements explicitly targeting Rothschild banks and properties. In Austria, in Germany, in France, the ground beneath the family's power was beginning to tilt. The castle Ferdinand had raised as a monument to safety now sat in a world that was becoming less safe by the year. James de Rothschild, overseeing Waddesdon in the 1920s and 1930s, faced a dilemma he could never fully resolve. Should he preserve the house exactly as his uncle had conceived it, a monument to arrival and permanence, even as European anti-Semitism turned more threatening? Or should he admit that the security Waddesdon was meant to symbolize had always been conditional at best? He chose preservation. The weekends continued. The collections expanded. The gardens remained immaculate. Waddesdon stayed dazzling. But the meaning of its grandeur was changing. The house no longer felt like proof that the family had arrived. It was starting to resemble a stronghold, a place to pull back to when the outside world grew hostile. And that outside world was darkening fast. By the middle of the 1930s, news from Germany could not be waved away. Jewish businesses were being seized. Jewish families pushed out of jobs, homes, public life. Rothschild properties in Frankfurt and Vienna came under direct threat. Relatives fled to London, to Paris, to anywhere that still seemed relatively safe. The Nazi propaganda machine fixated on the Rothschild name. State-produced posters and broadcasts painted them as the invisible masterminds of international finance, the supposed puppet masters behind governments and wars. Conspiracy theory turned into official ideology, and now it was backed by the full machinery of a modern state: police, courts, bureaucracy, army, all aimed at dismantling exactly the kind of networked power and security the Rothschilds had spent generations constructing. Waddesdon still stood. The parterres were still precisely trimmed. The art still glittered behind glass. From a distance, nothing had changed. But the house on the hill was beginning to feel less like an answer and more like a question. What do you do with a castle when the ground beneath it starts to move? The reply would arrive soon enough. First, the world had to fracture completely. The clouds gathering over Europe in the late 1930s were not just metaphorical. They were real storm fronts, rolling from east to west, and Waddesdon, exposed on its hilltop, lay directly in their path. Understanding why Waddesdon mattered means understanding what the Rothschilds actually did. Most people think of them as simply rich bankers, a convenient label. But the engine behind their wealth, how it was created, how it moved, what it paid for, was far more intricate and far more consequential than that phrase suggests. The system began with 5 brothers in the early 19th century. Their father, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, ran a modest but ambitious banking house in Frankfurt. As his sons came of age, he did something unusual. He scattered them across Europe. Nathan went to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Amschel remained in Frankfurt. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 banking houses that behaved not as rivals, but as one organism. The real innovation was not just money, it was communication. Before telegraphs and telephones, information traveled at the pace of horses and ships. The Rothschilds built their own courier network, trusted riders carrying encrypted letters between the 5 branches, often moving faster than official mail, faster than diplomatic channels. They heard about political crises, military campaigns, and market shocks before almost anyone else. Information in their hands became profit. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815, Nathan Rothschild in London knew before the British government did. His messengers got there first. He used that lead to position himself in the bond market and made enormous gains. Later storytellers turned this into legend. Some claim he staged dramatic trades to trick the market. Others say he simply moved quickly on good information. The exact choreography is still debated. What is clear is that the Rothschilds came out of the Napoleonic Wars as the dominant banking family in Europe. They lent to governments, not through conquest or looting, but through bonds and loans. When Britain needed money to wage war or build railways, Rothschild funds filled the gap. When France had to pay war reparations, the family structured the payments. When new states emerged and needed capital to stand up ministries and armies, it was often a Rothschild office that took the first meeting. That made them indispensable. It also painted a target on their backs, because the network did not swear allegiance to any single flag. It financed British railway expansion, French government borrowing, Austrian industrial schemes. It moved capital wherever opportunity existed. The loyalty was to the family system, which floated above borders. In peacetime, this was brilliant. Money flowing between London and Paris and Vienna, contracts negotiated between cousins, profits piling up across the network. In wartime, those same cousins found themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield. The family's footprint was everywhere. Neutrality was impossible to explain and dangerous to admit. Waddesdon sat inside this structure as one node among many, not as a formal bank branch. Ferdinand had stepped back from daily finance, but as a safe, polished space where power could gather. Ministers, investors, and foreign envoys could be entertained far from parliamentary debates or newspaper offices. Conversations that would have looked suspicious in a counting house could happen over dinner or during a walk through the gardens. Without a single ledger in sight, those glittering weekend parties doubled as quiet reconnaissance missions. They built relationships. They refreshed alliances. For Ferdinand, and later for James, this was how you maintained the family's position without signing checks in front of guests. You did it by knowing everyone, hearing everything, and making sure the people who mattered felt comfortable in your house. Who turned up at Waddesdon mattered as much as what they did there. A cabinet minister staying for 2 nights meant a direct line into government thinking. A foreign diplomat shooting pheasants on the estate meant early rumors about shifting borders or trade deals. The Prince of Wales lounging in the library with a cigar signaled royal favor, which translated into easier access at every level of British society and politics. The house was never just one thing. It was a display of taste, a social magnet, and quietly, a piece of financial infrastructure. A place where information, trust, and influence circulated as efficiently as money. The moral tangle behind all this was rarely discussed in public. The Rothschilds funded hospitals, schools, charities, water systems. They also financed wars, colonial ventures, and policies that enriched certain countries while draining others. The same loans that built rail lines across Europe helped extract raw materials from Africa and Asia. The same network that calmed markets concentrated extraordinary power inside a very small circle of related families. Whether Ferdinand, wandering his galleries at night, wrestled with these contradictions is something the archives do not tell us. There are no confessional diaries explaining how he squared Rembrandts on the wall with the battles and bargains that had paid for them. What we do know is that he understood the core bargain. The chateau on the hill existed because the money machine existed, and the money machine functioned because it was fast, transnational, and loyal to no entity but itself. This was old money in one of its purest forms. Not the fairy tale of a lone genius getting rich through sheer effort, though the Rothschilds were undeniably sharp and relentless, but wealth built through a system that lived above nation-states, capital that moved faster than laws could catch it, power that answered first to family interest and only distantly, if at all, to public oversight. Waddesdon was beautiful. The gardens were precise and theatrical. The art was museum quality. Guests remember the glow of chandeliers, the sweep of staircases, the perfect symmetry of flower beds. But beneath the surface, a tougher question lingered in every polished reflection. What had all this beauty cost? And who exactly had paid the price? The guests saw perfection. The servants made it possible. A day at Waddesdon began long before the family woke, 4:30 in the morning, 5 at the latest. The house had to be fully awake and functioning before anyone upstairs opened their eyes. Kitchen maids lit the coal ranges, massive iron beasts that heated the ovens and the water for an entire day's cooking. Scullery maids hauled buckets despite Waddesdon's modern plumbing. The house had running water, which was a luxury, but the kitchen still depended on constant manual labor. Housemaids moved through the reception rooms, cleaning grates, laying fresh fires, dusting furniture that had been dusted yesterday and would be dusted again tomorrow. The butler oversaw it all, At Waddesdon, his position carried real authority. He managed the male staff, footmen, under-butlers, hall boys. He controlled the wine cellar, one of the finest private collections in England. He choreographed service for dinners that might seat 20 guests across a long sequence of courses. Below stairs, his word was law. The housekeeper held equivalent power over the women. She directed the housemaids, ladies' maids, and laundry workers. She kept linen inventories, inspected bedrooms, checked that every surface shone. Her standards were unforgiving. A streak on a mirror, a crease in a bedsheet, dust in a corner, any of these could mean dismissal. This was not Ferdinand's personal cruelty. It was simply how great houses functioned. Servants were expected to be invisible and flawless. The two demands reinforced each other. To stay unseen, you had to do your work so precisely that no one ever noticed you doing it. The hierarchy below stairs was rigid. At the top, butler and housekeeper. Just beneath them, valets and ladies' maids, those who dressed the family and guests, handled personal possessions, maintained wardrobes. Below that layer came the footmen and housemaids, lower still, the kitchen staff. And at the very bottom, scullery maids and hall boys, teenagers doing the filthiest work for the smallest pay. Everyone knew their place. Crossing a boundary meant consequences. Servants' meals were taken in shifts in the servants' hall, a large room in the basement. Even here, status dictated everything. Upper servants, butler, housekeeper, valets, ladies' maids, ate apart from the rest. They had better food, served on better crockery, at a table where conversation was allowed. Lower servants ate more quickly, spoke less, and went straight back to their tasks. The bell system controlled movement like a nervous system. Every major room upstairs had a bell pull. When someone tugged it, a corresponding bell jingled downstairs in the servants' corridor. Springs and wires ran through the walls, connecting the two worlds. Each bell had its own tone. Experienced staff could identify the calling room by sound alone. When a bell rang, somebody moved. Immediately. The family and their guests did not wait. What the servants actually thought of their employers is only partly visible. A handful of letters survive, a few diaries, occasional notes in household ledgers. Put together, they form a complicated picture. By contemporary standards, the Rothschilds paid well, better than many aristocratic houses. The work was exhausting, the hours long, but the wages were competitive and generally on time. Some servants stayed for decades, which suggests they found the conditions acceptable, maybe even preferable to factory work or domestic service in harsher households. Yet the awareness of difference never disappeared. The Rothschilds were foreign, Jewish. Staff understood that this shaped how the outside world saw their employers and, indirectly, how it saw them for serving in a Rothschild house. Some took pride in that association. Working at Waddesdon meant working at one of the great houses of England. The Prince of Wales slept in beds they had made. Cabinet ministers ate food they had carried. That kind of reflected prestige mattered, even if it was second-hand and conditional. Others were more conflicted. Letters from former employees that surface in archives describe the family as kind enough or fair, but also demanding and very particular. The implication is clear. This was a job, not a kinship. The relationship was transactional. Respect existed, but it flowed mostly in one direction, up. And beneath everything lay the basic imbalance of power. A servant could be dismissed for almost anything, an error, a complaint, a clash with a superior. Dismissal meant instant loss of income and housing. Most lived on the estate. And worst of all, the loss of a reference. Without a good reference, finding another position became nearly impossible. The Rothschilds were not notorious tyrants. By most accounts, they treated staff better than many of their peers. But kindness from a position of total control is still a form of control. A gentle master is still a master. The servants at Waddesdon kept the whole machine running. They maintained the illusion that wealth and beauty existed naturally, that fireplaces lit themselves, and 12-course meals appeared without planning or sweat. They enabled Ferdinand's performance of belonging, and later James's performance of continuity. They did all of this knowing that no matter how critical their work was, they would never dine in the great hall upstairs, never sit and read in the library, never own anything remotely like the objects they cleaned and polished every day. That was the bargain. That was how old money operated, not just as accumulated capital, but as accumulated invisible labor, other people's effort, built into the walls and then written out of the story. The house still stands. The servants' bells still hang in the corridors below, silent now, part of the museum displays. But once, they rang constantly, and whenever they did, someone ran. The servants knew their place in the hierarchy. The Rothschilds knew theirs too. It was just less clearly marked. In 1898, the same year Ferdinand died, a cartoon appeared in a French newspaper. It showed a grotesque figure with exaggerated features, hooked nose, clawed hands wrapped around a globe labeled World Finance. The caption named it simply Rothschild. This was nothing unusual. Caricatures like that appeared regularly across Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in France, and in England. The details changed slightly. Sometimes the figure clutched money bags, sometimes puppet strings attached to tiny politicians, sometimes both at once. But the message never shifted. The Rothschilds as sinister, inhuman forces secretly controlling world events. These were not underground leaflets. They ran in mainstream newspapers, in popular magazines sold on street corners, in political pamphlets passed around in parliaments. The anti-Semitism was casual, normalized, woven into everyday public life. And yet, the Prince of Wales kept visiting Waddesdon. Queen Victoria had attended Rothschild weddings. The family held titles: Baron Ferdinand, Baron Lionel, Baron Nathaniel, granted by the British Crown and other European monarchs. They were on guest lists for state occasions. Their donations funded hospitals, schools, parks. Buildings in London and Paris carried their name. This was the paradox the Rothschilds lived inside, at once essential and despised, welcomed and mocked, powerful and exposed. The English aristocracy embodied that contradiction perfectly. They came to Waddesdon's parties. They admired the collections. They turned to Rothschild banks when their own estates needed rescuing. Some even married Rothschild daughters when the dowries were large enough to patch their finances. And then they went home and joked about it. The language was often coded. Memoirs and letters referred to our Israelite friends. Descriptions of Rothschild houses mentioned Oriental taste. Compliments on hospitality arrived with subtle qualifiers. This was not quite English style, not quite the same as a weekend with the Duke of Devonshire. The Rothschilds heard all of it. They were too sharp, too plugged in, not to. Ferdinand read the papers. He saw the cartoons. He received letters from relatives on the continent describing worse: street attacks, boycotts, new rules restricting Jewish businesses, political campaigns built entirely on hostility to Jewish wealth. His answer was to build higher, to refine further, to make Waddesdon so magnificent it could not be brushed aside. If they were going to sneer anyway, let them sneer at a Renaissance château full of masterpieces their own families had been forced to sell to pay debts. This was defensive architecture, not only stone walls and towers, but taste and elegance sharpened into a shield against prejudice. Every flawless dinner party was an exhibit. Every royal visit was another line of evidence. See, the house seemed to insist. Look at what we have created. Look how well we understand your world. Look how we belong. But belonging bought through perfection is exhausting, because once perfection becomes the entry ticket, it has to be maintained, always. One scandal, one misstep, one moment of seeming too Jewish or too foreign or too aggressively wealthy in the wrong context, and the fragile acceptance could shatter. The Rothschilds could not afford to be merely competent. They had to be exceptional in every direction. Their houses had to be more impressive, their parties more polished, their philanthropy more visible, their business dealings more discreet. Any failure seemed to confirm what the cartoons already claimed, that they were outsiders playing dress-up as aristocrats. That pressure seeped into everything, into the obsessive attention to detail at Waddesdon, into the carefully curated guest lists, into the political donations spread across parties so that, whoever won elections, someone at the top would feel indebted to the family, into the strategy of marrying within the clan, keeping money and influence tightly contained, into the disciplined silence whenever a new caricature appeared. Never complain, never explain, never feed the fire. It was a survival strategy wearing the mask of effortless success, and it worked to a point. The family kept its power. Waddesdon kept its sheen. The banking network kept humming. Underneath, though, was a constant awareness that none of it was guaranteed, that invitations could dry up, that honors could be withdrawn, that the foundations under the castle were conditional in a way they were not for families whose names ran back through the Domesday Book. The English aristocracy traced some of their lineages to knights who had crossed the Channel with William the Conqueror in 1066. The Rothschild story ran through Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto, streets where Jews had been locked in at night, restricted in trade, treated as permanent outsiders by law. Ferdinand had been gone less than a generation, but the family carried that memory like a second spine. It shaped their instincts, their defensive posture, their relentless need for control and polish. History had taught them that safety was always temporary, that being loved and hated at the same time was normal, that you could own a palace and still not fully own your place in the country around it. The caricatures kept appearing, the invitations kept arriving, and the Rothschilds kept walking the same impossible line, visible enough to matter, not so visible as to become the perfect enemy, wealthy enough to be respected. Not so ostentatiously wealthy that resentment boiled over, Jewish enough to remain themselves, not so openly Jewish that Christian society turned away. It was a balance no one could keep forever. And then the world broke. The balancing act ended in August 1914. When war erupted across Europe, the Rothschild banking network, designed to float above borders, built on blood ties between capitals, suddenly became impossible to operate as before. Nations demanded clear loyalty. You were British or German or French or Austrian. You could not be all of them at once. The family had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Cousins who had worked together for decades woke up to find themselves on opposite sides of the same conflict. The London Rothschilds were now British. The Vienna and Frankfurt Rothschilds belonged to the Central Powers. The Paris Rothschilds were French, the same family, different uniforms, different flags. This created situations with no good answers. Lionel Walter Rothschild, Ferdinand's nephew, was a British citizen with close relatives in Germany. In public, he supported the British war effort without hesitation. At the same time, some of his cousins saw their businesses labeled enemy assets, not because of anything they had done, but because of where they lived. What do you do when your own family is officially the enemy? The practical answer was, you stop talking. The London house cut formal communication with Vienna and Frankfurt. Business ties that had worked smoothly for nearly a century were suspended or quietly unwound. The family network, which had once been their greatest competitive advantage, turned into a danger. Each branch now had to prove loyalty to its own government, and the easiest way to do that was to act as if the others did not exist. Beneath that, a deeper crack was forming. War tore into the illusion of safety that places like Waddesdon had been built to project. The estate itself lay far from any front line. Buckinghamshire would not see German troops. No trenches were dug through Ferdinand's parterres. No shells landed on his towers. But the war still arrived, carried by the men who left and did not return. Waddesdon's staff shrank brutally. Footmen and hall boys enlisted. Gardeners joined up, the under-butler, the second footman. 3 of the stable hands all signed their names at recruiting offices and went to France. Some came back with wounds. Some came back in coffins. Some never came back at all. Their names are chiseled into the estate's war memorial, raised after the fighting ended. A simple stone, the list carved in alphabetical order. No separation between servants and family. In death, for once, the hierarchy fell silent. The house kept going, but only just. James de Rothschild, who had inherited Waddesdon from his mother Alice, enlisted himself. He served with distinction, was wounded, then returned to duty. While he was away, the château sat mostly empty. A reduced staff kept it alive in slow motion. Fires lit, basic maintenance done, waiting for a version of the world that would never fully come back. The damage to the wider Rothschild web was far worse. The Vienna branch, once among the most powerful, was hammered by the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Properties were seized, assets frozen or written down to nothing. The Frankfurt house faced similar pressure inside a defeated Germany. What had taken 100 years to assemble fractured along sharp national lines that had barely existed when the system was first built. And under all this lay a brutal realization: money could not insulate anyone from industrialized slaughter. The Rothschilds had financed railways and governments. They had underwritten national debts, built palaces, bought masterpieces. They had entertained princes and prime ministers beneath ceilings painted in gold. None of that mattered to machine guns and high-explosive shells. When millions of men were mobilized to kill and be killed, no chateau on a hill could guarantee that its staff, or its owners, would be spared. Ferdinand's dream of security through success looked increasingly fragile. You could build the perfect house on an English hill, fill it with beauty and hand-picked guests, prove, over and over, that you had taste and status and a claim to belong. And then war arrived, and boys who had polished your silver died in French mud, and your family's transnational business was ripped apart along battle lines. And all that perfection revealed how little it could actually control. The moral complexity of the family's position became harder to ignore. The Rothschilds had helped issue the bonds that funded the war. On multiple sides: British war loans, French government borrowing, post-war reconstruction issues. They earned fees and interest from the mechanisms of war, even as those same mechanisms destroyed people they knew. They were not alone in this. Most major banks did the same. But the Rothschild name made them a perfect target. During and after the war, antisemitic propagandists claimed Jewish financiers had caused the conflict. Old caricatures grew sharper. New posters and pamphlets pushed even wilder stories. The Rothschilds were accused of profiting from Christian bloodshed, of manipulating cabinets into war purely for gain. Some accusations landed close to an uncomfortable truth, though not in the way the agitators meant. The family did profit from war finance. So did British banks, German banks, French banks. The difference was that when Christian-owned banks earned money from war, it could be framed as patriotic service. When Jewish-owned banks did the same, it was proof, supposedly, of a hidden plot. When James returned to Waddesdon after 1918, he found a house that was both unchanged and completely different. The walls were still standing. The collections were still in place. The gardens could be coaxed back into perfect order. But the staff was thinner. The atmosphere was heavier. The parties resumed, but they now carried a different undertone. Less certainty, less belief that the world could be bent into shape through charm, precision, and performance. The memorial to the dead servants stood out in the grounds, a quiet, stubborn reminder that the château had failed its deepest promise. It had been built to symbolize protection, safety, distance from chaos. Yet the chaos had arrived anyway, and it had taken young men who had laid fires, polished silver, served wine, and trimmed hedges, men who had kept the illusion running. Their names in stone were now the most honest thing on the estate, fixed, unarguable. Permanent in a way that Ferdinand's social engineering had never truly been. The war ended in 1918, but for Waddesdon, and for the family who raised it, something basic had been shattered. The belief that wealth could purchase lasting safety was gone. And beyond the horizon, something even worse was gathering. The parties came back, but they were different now. James de Rothschild reopened Waddesdon fully in the early 1920s. The house was scrubbed from attic to basement. The gardens were coaxed back into symmetry. Staff were rehired, though never quite to pre-war numbers. The chandeliers blazed again. Guests returned for weekends that, on the surface, looked remarkably like the ones Ferdinand had hosted 3 decades earlier. But underneath the shine, everyone could feel how thin it had become. The interwar years were strange for places like Waddesdon. On one hand, there was a kind of stubborn glamour. Fast cars now pulled up on the drive, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, gleaming machines that made the old carriages look like museum pieces. Jazz crackled from gramophones. Women's hemlines rose. Cocktails began to edge out the rigid, multi-course Victorian dinners, although those still appeared when the occasion demanded ceremony. This was modernity arriving at the château, new money mixing with old, American heiresses buying European titles, social rules loosening where once they had been carved in stone. In theory, this should have made life easier for the Rothschilds. If the old barriers were lowering, if society was opening up, then a family of Jewish bankers with a French château in England ought to fit more naturally into the scene. But anti-Semitism was modernizing too. In Germany, the Weimar Republic lurched between inflation, coups, and street violence. The Nazis started as a fringe party in the early 1920s, then grew, then turned into a serious threat. Their propaganda fixated on Jewish finance and gave it a face. They did not talk about bankers in the abstract. They used names. Rothschild appeared again and again in their pamphlets and speeches, shorthand for everything they claimed was poisoning Germany. There was nothing subtle about it. Nazi newspapers printed lists of Jewish-owned businesses to boycott, directories of Jewish professionals to avoid, brochures and posters that openly called for Jewish wealth and influence to be smashed. The Rothschilds sat at the top of many of these lists, perfect symbols for a hatred that needed an easy target. News of this reached Waddesdon in letters from relatives still in Frankfurt and Vienna. The tone darkened with each year. Business restrictions, exclusion from clubs and societies, beatings in the street, shop windows smashed. The German and Austrian branches of the family were under growing pressure. Properties were seized under legal pretexts, bank accounts frozen. The machinery of the state was being turned step by step against Jewish money. James read these letters in the Waddesdon Library, the same room where Ferdinand had once entertained the Prince of Wales, where ministers had talked policy over brandy and cigars, where the illusion of rock-solid security had been carefully curated. That illusion was cracking across the continent. In France, where another major branch of the family operated, the situation looked different but was hardly comfortable. French anti-Semitism had its own flavor, less overtly violent than what was developing in Germany, but persistent and deeply rooted. The Dreyfus affair of the 1890s had already shown how quickly accusations against a single Jewish officer could tear the country apart. The Paris Rothschilds carried on, maintaining their bank and their social position, but they did so with increasing caution. England still felt safer. British anti-Semitism certainly existed. The drawing room jokes, the club doors that stayed closed, the casual slights had never vanished, but it did not yet have the systematized, state-driven brutality that was forming in Germany and Austria. British Jews faced prejudice and ceilings, not organized elimination. Waddesdon began to function more and more as a refuge. Family members came from France, from Austria, from Germany, cousins whose businesses had been undermined, relatives who had been pushed out of positions or harassed in the streets. The house that Ferdinand built to prove that Rothschilds belonged in European high society now doubled as a safe house for relatives being told, loudly and officially, that they did not belong anywhere. The gatherings took on a double life. On weekends with British guests, everything looked normal. Guns on the peg in the morning, shooting parties in the fields, formal dinners, conversation flowing under the chandeliers. The full performance of aristocratic leisure stayed in place. On quieter weeks, when only family were present, the mood shifted. Conversations in the same drawing rooms turned to escape routes and deadlines. What to do with the Frankfurt house? Whether to pull out of Vienna entirely? How to move vulnerable relatives to London or Paris before borders tightened further? James tried to keep both worlds going. The public Waddesdon, elegant, generous, plugged into British politics and culture, and the private Waddesdon, an operations room for a family under pressure, drawing up survival plans in spaces designed for entertainment. The art collection Ferdinand had assembled with such care now carried a second meaning. These were no longer only beautiful things to hang on walls and place on pedestals. They were condensed, portable wealth, assets that could be moved quickly, hidden if necessary, or sold to fund escape. Paintings started to travel quietly, to London vaults, to Paris storerooms, where they might be safer than on the walls of houses under threat. By the mid-1930s, no one could pretend not to see what was happening in Germany. Hitler was in power. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and rights. The Frankfurt Rothschild Bank, the home branch where Mayor Amschel had once lent coins from a small house, was forced to close. That ancestral house was seized. Then came November 1938. Letters and cables arrived at Waddesdon describing Kristallnacht, synagogues burning, Jewish shops smashed and looted, men dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. It was not random fury. It was coordinated, state-directed violence. James convened a family meeting at Waddesdon in late 1938. The agenda was brutally simple: survival. How to get remaining relatives out of Germany and Austria. How to protect what assets could still be moved. How to keep the still functioning parts of the banking empire alive, while accepting that some branches would have to be abandoned. The château, sitting on its English hill, felt both sheltered and exposed. Geographically, it was far from the worst of the violence, but symbolically, it was exactly the sort of place fascists loved to point at: visible Jewish wealth, built to project influence. The very features that had made Waddesdon a triumph now made it a perfect target in any narrative about Jewish power. The beauty of the place did not fade. The parterres were still clipped into precise patterns. The fountains still played. The pictures still shone behind glass. But it was beauty on thin ice. everyone could sense the cracks, even if they could not yet see how deep they ran. By 1939, the question was no longer whether war would return to Europe. It was what and who would still be standing when it was over. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to last forever, to nail down permanence, to prove that the Rothschilds belonged in Europe as much as any family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. Roughly 60 years later, Europe was preparing to tear itself apart again. And this time, the Rothschilds were not just convenient symbols in cartoons. They were being named, explicitly, as enemies. The lights at Waddesdon would go out again soon. This time, nobody could be sure they would ever come back on. The blackout order came in September 1939. Every window at Waddesdon had to be covered. Heavy curtains went up. Tape was stretched across panes in X patterns to reduce shattering from blast. The chandeliers that had once symbolized Ferdinand's victory over darkness, electric light blazing in the countryside when nearby villages still relied on gas, went dark. The house became a shadow of itself. James de Rothschild joined the military again, even though he was in his 40s. He had served in the First World War, been wounded, gone back. Now he was doing it all over again. The family's London house was shut. Waddesdon became the main refuge, but only in a stripped-down, hollow version of what it had been. Most of the staff were gone, enlisted, conscripted. Drawn into factories now turning out weapons instead of goods for peacetime. The skeleton crew left behind kept only the basics alive, maintaining the structure, stopping damp from eating the walls, keeping the grounds from collapsing entirely. The formal gardens were largely abandoned. The greenhouses that had once produced exotic flowers for Ferdinand's weekend parties were turned over to growing vegetables. It was practical, and it was symbolic. The house built to showcase refinement now concentrated on simple survival. Then a quiet request came from the British government. The National Gallery in London needed safe storage. German bombing raids threatened the capital's museums. Priceless paintings and sculptures needed to be moved out, to places that could be secured and kept dry, cool, and stable. Waddesdon, with its thick walls, strong rooms, and distance from the city, was ideal. Crates arrived in 1940, carefully packed canvases, sculptures wrapped in protective materials, works by Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Reynolds, pieces that defined British cultural identity, hidden in the basement of a house built by Jewish immigrants to prove they understood European culture as well as anyone. No one involved missed the irony. The house became a strange hybrid, part empty mansion, part military staging area. Troops were occasionally billeted on the grounds, part secret vault for a national collection. The grand entrance hall, where Ferdinand had once entertained princes, now held stacked crates marked with inventory numbers instead of guests in evening dress. Meanwhile, across Europe, the family's worst fears were coming true. The Paris Rothschild mansion was seized by the Nazis in 1940 after France fell. German officers took over the rooms. Hermann Göring personally chose pieces from the Rothschild collection for his private hoard. The theft was not random looting. It was planned, written down, and enforced by the Nazi state. Vienna properties had already been taken. The Frankfurt house was destroyed. Relatives who had not escaped were murdered. The exact number will never be fully known. Holocaust records were incomplete, and some were deliberately erased, but Rothschild family members died in camps. The name that had once stood for wealth and power offered no protection against a system built to exterminate. Letters reached Waddesdon slowly, through neutral countries and delayed channels. Each envelope brought worse news. Cousins missing. Homes emptied. Businesses dissolved by decree. Bank accounts drained under the cover of law. The European network that had taken 5 generations to build was being methodically dismantled. James, serving in British uniform, received these updates between duties. The mental whiplash was brutal. He was fighting to defend Europe while learning that Europe was wiping out his family's place within it. Fighting for civilization, while that same civilization revealed what it was capable of doing. Waddesdon itself stood. The roof was intact. The walls held. The pictures stored in its basements survived without damage. But the world it embodied, the belief that money, art, and careful social choreography could create lasting safety, was gone. Some Rothschilds who escaped to England spent time at Waddesdon during the war. Refugees in a house their own relatives had built to announce arrival. The chateau finally became what it had always threatened to become, not a symbol of having been accepted, but an actual fortress, not a statement of belonging, but a place to hide. The village saw the war differently. Ration books, sirens and blackouts, sons and brothers away at the front. But they also watched Waddesdon change. The grand estate that had seemed separate from ordinary life was now part of the national emergency. The Rothschilds, long whispered about as foreign and suspect, were suddenly visible on the same side as everyone else. That did not erase centuries of antisemitism, but it complicated the story. It was hard to claim the Rothschilds were disloyal when James wore British khaki and Waddesdon's cellars sheltered paintings the whole country claimed as its own. By 1945, the war in Europe was staggering to an end. The crates in Waddesdon's basement were opened and sent back to London. The National Gallery reclaimed its works, unharmed. The house had done its job. It had protected what was placed in its care. Yet when James came home and walked the echoing rooms, the victory felt thin. The building stood. The British branch of the family had survived. But the web that had once stretched across Europe was shattered. Continental branches were gone or gutted. Family members were dead. Properties erased. The banking empire that had once slipped easily over borders was now confined to a handful of countries where Rothschilds still had a foothold. Ferdinand's château had survived the war in stone and slate, but the world it had been built for, the aristocratic, cosmopolitan Europe where powerful families could operate above nations, had vanished. What do you do with a palace designed for a world that no longer exists? That question would shape the next chapter of Waddesdon's story. First, someone had to decide whether keeping it was even possible. James walked through Waddesdon in 1945 and saw a problem with no obvious solution. The house was structurally sound, the art collection intact. The grounds could be revived with enough money, time, and staff. But the economic reality was brutal. Keeping a chateau of this size alive required an enormous flow of cash, and in the New World, that expense needed a reason. Before the war, the justification had been clear. Waddesdon was social infrastructure for the family's banking power, a stage for entertaining, for building relationships, for reinforcing the Rothschild position in British high society. The house was not just a cost, it was a tool, an investment in influence and access. Post-war Britain was something else entirely. The aristocratic system Ferdinand had spent his life trying to break into was collapsing. Inheritance taxes and death duties were smashing landed estates across the country. Country houses were being stripped, abandoned, demolished, or handed over as schools, hospitals, and military colleges. The great weekend house parties were ending, not because people had stopped wanting them, but because almost nobody could afford to host them. The Rothschild banking operations had survived, but in a reduced, reshaped form. The old European network was fractured. The need for a grand English estate to impress continental cousins and clients had largely vanished. Many of those cousins were dead or scattered. Those clients were now dealing with new institutions in a new financial order. On paper, James had obvious options. he could sell Waddesdon, find a buyer willing to shoulder the maintenance, break up or auction the collection, turn the house over to an institution, and walk away. Other families in similar positions were doing exactly that every month, but there was someone who could not accept that answer. Dorothy de Rothschild, James's wife, saw something else when she looked at Waddesdon. She understood that it was more than a beautiful, expensive problem. It was a document in stone and wood, a record of a particular moment in European history, a monument to what a Jewish banking family had built and what it had survived, evidence of extraordinary success and at the same time of deep vulnerability. To simply sell it off or let it decay felt like tearing out a chapter of history. Yet keeping it as a private family house felt increasingly unrealistic. The solution they moved toward was radical for its era: collaborate with the National Trust, a British organization created to preserve places of historic importance, and shift Waddesdon from private palace to public heritage. This was not a simple act of charity. The negotiations were detailed and tough. The family would keep certain rights and a voice in how things were done. The house would be preserved to agreed standards. The core of the art collection would stay together on site. Public access would be offered, but carefully controlled, so that the property was protected even as people who would never have been invited in Ferdinand's day could finally walk through the rooms. Agreeing to this meant admitting something Ferdinand had spent his life resisting: that Waddesdon's greatest value now lay in its historical meaning, not in its use as a private status symbol, that its significance went beyond the family, that the surest way to save what he had created was to surrender exclusive ownership of it. James died in 1957 before the full transition could be completed. Dorothy carried the project forward. The formal arrangement with the National Trust was finalized in the 1950s, though the family stayed involved in management and continued to add pieces to the collections. Waddesdon acquired a new identity, no longer a private residence performing aristocratic belonging. Instead, a museum and heritage site, trying, at first cautiously, to acknowledge its layered history while preserving its visual splendor. But real preservation demanded honesty, and honesty meant asking questions that earlier generations had mostly avoided. What exactly had Ferdinand been doing when he built this place? How, specifically, had the money been earned that paid for every stone and painting? Where were the stories of the people downstairs, the servants whose labor had made the illusion of effortless luxury possible? How did antisemitism shape the family's choices? What compromises had they made to survive inside a system that never fully accepted them? For decades after opening to visitors, the official story stayed on safe ground. Guides talked about the architecture, the provenance of the paintings, the brilliance of Ferdinand's taste. Guests walked through rooms hearing about French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, and Renaissance portraits. Almost nothing about the lives lived here, or the political storms raging outside the windows. It was comfortable history, beautiful history. A version of the past that let people admire wealth and culture without having to think too hard about how either was acquired. It was also incomplete. As time passed and new historians and curators took charge, pressure grew to widen the frame. The archives were opened properly, boxes in attics and storerooms were examined, servant records were read, letters between family members decoded, account books combed through. Slowly, a different picture came into focus. Ferdinand was not just a refined collector. He was a man marked by illness and grief, building a fortress against loss and rejection. The weekend parties were not just scenes of elegance. They were calculated performances designed to purchase a sense of belonging that remained conditional. The servants were not anonymous staff. They were individuals with names, hopes, and sharply limited choices, working inside a hierarchy that exploited their labor, however relatively kind their employers might have been. The house began to tell these stories too, not to erase the beauty, but to frame it, not to deny Ferdinand's achievements, but to ask what they cost, to whom, and why. The change was gradual and not without resistance. Some visitors wanted the fairy tale version, the glowing château, the dazzling dinners, the simple narrative of exceptional taste and success. Others wanted the fuller account, the whole tangled, morally complicated story of what old money actually involves, and what it demands from everyone caught up in its orbit. Freed from its old job as a private palace, Waddesdon could finally become what it had always had the potential to be: evidence, a physical record. A place where the past is preserved not just to be admired, but to be understood. The open question is whether people are willing to listen to that full story, once the doors have been opened wide enough to let it be told. The attic at Waddesdon held secrets no one had seriously examined: boxes of papers, decades of household accounts, employment records for servants whose names had never appeared in glossy guidebooks, letters between family members discussing subjects that had been carefully excluded from the polished stories told to visitors. Invoices listing, line by line, how much Ferdinand had paid for every chandelier, every painting, every stone in the facade. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation of curators and historians began working through this material systematically. What they found complicated every neat story about the house. The servant records were especially revealing: names, ages, positions, wages, reasons for hiring and dismissal. Over the decades, hundreds of people had worked at Waddesdon. Most stayed only a few years. Some remained for 20 or 30. A few were dismissed for reasons that ranged from understandable, persistent theft, chronic unreliability, to chilling pregnancy, which meant automatic termination for many women regardless of circumstance. The wage books were precise. A head housemaid in the 1890s earned roughly £30 per year. A scullery maid earned about 12. The butler drew closer to 80 plus accommodation and food. For the period, these were competitive rates, better than what many aristocratic estates offered. But context changed everything. Ferdinand routinely spent thousands of pounds on a single painting. In some years, the entire annual wage bill for the household came to less than the price of one major work of art. That sort of disparity was typical of the time. Yet seeing it laid out in columns of ink made the class hierarchy feel brutally concrete, in a way that soft phrases like skilled domestic staff never had. The private letters between family members exposed anxieties the public Waddesdon had always hidden. Ferdinand, writing about his isolation in England, about drawing-room anti-Semitism he encountered even among people happy to dine at his table, about knowing that no matter how perfect the house, a part of British society would always see him as foreign and suspect. Later letters from the interwar years traced the rising fear around European anti-Semitism, discussions about shifting assets, worries about cousins in Germany and Austria, careful calculations about how publicly Jewish to be: too visible, and you became a convenient target; too invisible, and you risked losing community. Identity and leverage. These discoveries were uncomfortable. They shattered the idea of Waddesdon as a straightforward success story, but they were crucial. They showed that even immense wealth could not fully shield a Jewish family from the prejudices of their era, that the performance of belonging was relentless, exhausting, and never quite complete, that the castle on the hill had always been more fragile than it looked from the drive. Curators now had a choice: keep telling the sanitized version, gorgeous house, impeccable taste, the end, or thread these tougher truths into tours and exhibitions. They chose to widen the story, gradually, carefully, but deliberately. New interpretive panels appeared, texts that named and described the servants who kept the house running, exhibitions that explored Ferdinand's experience as a Jewish immigrant in Victorian England, Tours that talked frankly about the family's wartime history, both as targets of Nazi persecution and as contributors to Britain's war effort. For some visitors, this was unwelcome. They arrived wanting a fairy tale, elegant rooms, glittering chandeliers, an uncomplicated fantasy of how the other half lived. They did not want to think about class exploitation, religious prejudice, or the moral tangle of banking fortunes. Others reacted very differently. Younger visitors in particular responded strongly to the honesty. They appreciated that the house was not pretending, that it acknowledged the servants' labor, that it named the prejudice Ferdinand had faced, that it dared to ask what all this beauty had cost, and who had ultimately paid. Waddesdon began working with scholars whose topics it had once avoided: labor historians studying Victorian domestic service, researchers documenting anti-Semitism in Britain, specialists in the history of wealth, inequality, and old money. The house opened its archives and invited difficult questions instead of dodging them. Some findings surprised even the curators. Evidence that Ferdinand, on certain issues, was more progressive than many of his peers, supporting women's education, funding scholarships and civic projects. Alongside that sat evidence of the everyday cruelty baked into the system he inhabited. Servants dismissed without references for minor infractions, effectively blacklisted. Lives overturned by decisions taken in a moment by employers who would never see the consequences. The continuing involvement of the Rothschild family meant these revelations required tact. This was still, in an important sense, their story. Yet to their credit, the family largely backed the more honest approach. They understood that real respect comes from telling the whole story, not just the flattering fragments. Dorothy de Rothschild's decision to bring in the National Trust had made this evolution possible. Once Waddesdon stopped functioning as a private residence serving current family needs, it was no longer necessary to maintain a flawless social facade. The pressure to use the house as a live status symbol eased. What remained was history, messy, morally ambiguous, deeply revealing history. The kind that resists simple heroes and villains and instead shows real people making hard choices inside structures that constrained everyone, but trapped some far more tightly than others. Waddesdon was not alone in this reckoning. Historic houses across Britain were also re-examining their origins, acknowledging the labor that built them, the colonial and financial systems that funded them, the hierarchies that kept them going. Yet Waddesdon added layers many other estates lacked: the Jewish story, the immigrant story, the particular vulnerability of being both extremely wealthy and persistently targeted, the way anti-Semitism and class shaped every decision, even for those with staggering resources. The tours changed, the exhibition shifted. The house became less about uncritically celebrating old money and more about examining it, taking it apart, understanding its mechanics and consequences, and asking what lessons it leaves behind. Some visitors still come simply to see beautiful rooms. That is fine. The rooms are still beautiful. But more and more, people arrive wanting to know what those rooms mean, what they stand for, what and whom they cost, who built them, who served in them, and what happened to all of those people when the music stopped. At last, the house is prepared to answer, fully, honestly, and without looking away. Walk into almost any movie about aristocratic wealth and you will recognize Waddesdon. Not necessarily the literal house, but the template. The long gravel drive cutting through manicured parkland. The slow approach. The sudden reveal of a massive château against the sky. Tall windows glowing at dusk. Staff in formal uniforms gliding through perfectly staged rooms. The instant visual shorthand for what old money is supposed to look like. Waddesdon helped invent that visual language before cinema existed. Once cameras arrived, the pattern Ferdinand created became the pattern everyone copied. Downton Abbey, Brideshead Revisited, Gosford Park, The Crown. Countless period dramas filmed in English country houses that all feel familiar. Even when they are not shooting at Waddesdon, they are borrowing its mood. French-style facades. Sweeping steps, formal terraces, interiors arranged like a lifestyle catalog for inherited wealth. The look is so entrenched it seems natural, inevitable, like great fortunes have always expressed themselves in French Renaissance stone, clipped lawns and silent servants. They have not. This look was invented, carefully, by people like Ferdinand who needed to prove a point. The English aristocracy already had its own architectural grammar: Georgian boxes, Palladian villas, genuinely medieval castles. They did not need to imitate France. Their houses announced lineage, not taste. The architecture said, "We have been here longer than anyone can remember." Ferdinand's generation of outsiders could not say that, so they made different claims: not ancient bloodline, but flawless taste; not centuries of inheritance, but mastery of culture; not "we have always been here, but we understand Europe better than you think." The French château style was perfect for this. It said, "I know the codes of civilization so well, I can lift them from the Loire and replant them on an English hill." It worked so effectively that it became the global template. American Gilded Age tycoons copied the playbook. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore in North Carolina, an even bigger French château, intentionally modeled on Loire Valley houses. The Astors, the Rockefellers, the rest of the industrial fortunes all gravitated toward European styles that screamed sophistication instead of frontier money. They were doing exactly what Ferdinand had done, using architecture as a resume, turning buildings into credentials that said, "This is not just cash, this is culture." Today, Instagram and social media amplify the same script. Waddesdon's official feeds show hundreds of thousands of people, the same set pieces: the parterres in autumn, Christmas lights wrapped around stone, the fountain at blue hour. Every image reinforces the aesthetic. This is elegance, this is aspiration, this is what success should look like. What those posts rarely show is everything you have just followed through 13 chapters. They do not show Ferdinand pacing the house at night, aware the building would never fully buy the belonging he wanted. They do not show servants stumbling out of bed before dawn to make sure luxury looked effortless by lunchtime. They do not show the antisemitic caricatures, the confiscated houses, the emergency family meetings about escape routes when Europe turned lethal. The aesthetic is gorgeous. The context is ruthless. That gap between image and reality is what old money has always depended on. The performance works because most people only ever see the costume. They see the facade, not the calculation. The lawns, not the labor. The glamorous dinner, not the anxiety humming under the table. Knowing this does not make Waddesdon less impressive. If anything, it makes it sharper. The house stops being just a pretty backdrop and becomes a document, a case study in how wealth performs legitimacy, how outsiders manufacture belonging, how power dresses itself up as taste. Modern viewers binging Downton Abbey or buying tickets to tour Waddesdon are stepping straight into a fantasy that people like Ferdinand helped design. The fantasy says, there was once a time when wealth was noble and tidy, when the rich were gracious, when servants and masters accepted their roles, when the system worked. It never actually worked like that. Servants resented their limits and feared dismissal. Employers worried constantly about status, scandal, and collapse. The machine produced beauty by burning through human effort and calling it order. Yet the fantasy hangs on because the aesthetic is addictive. French chateaux on English hills really are beautiful. Candlelit dining rooms look incredible on camera. The idea that old money is fundamentally refined and tasteful, rather than what it usually is, which is accumulated power over generations, often built through extractive or morally gray systems, is comforting. Waddesdon throws a question back at you. If you had Ferdinand's resources, what would you build? Another palace begging for approval from people who will never fully accept you. Something that admits what wealth really is? Something designed to share instead of to dazzle? That question is not hypothetical for anyone with money or with ambitions toward it. Social media is full of miniature Waddesdons, curated interiors, immaculate table settings, candid photos staged to signal status. The props are cheaper now. Ring lights instead of crystal chandeliers, rental villas instead of private estates. But the impulse is the same. Perform legitimacy. Prove you belong. Ferdinand wanted to belong so badly, he turned a hill into a statement. Waddesdon is still here, still stunning, still doing its original job of making wealth look like culture. But now we know what sat behind the performance. We have read the ledgers. We have glimpsed the servants' lives. We have seen how vulnerable the family remained even at the height of their power. We have watched the world that gave the house meaning collapse, and watched the mansion survive as evidence instead of fantasy. The mansion helped fix the image of old money in the global imagination. The image is beautiful. The reality is complicated. Beauty does not cancel that complexity. It just makes it a little easier to look away. The visitor pauses at the gates and looks back one more time. What Waddesdon offers now is something Ferdinand never aimed for, but may be more valuable than what he imagined. Not a polished fantasy of perfection, but a clear look at complexity. Not a shrine to old money, but a place to learn what old money actually was, and what it did. The house teaches uncomfortable lessons. That wealth does not guarantee safety. That acceptance bought through performance is fragile and exhausting. That beauty usually sits on top of invisible labor. That systems can exploit people even when some of the individuals inside them mean well. That you can be powerful and vulnerable at the same time. And that this tension can shape whole eras. But the house also carries a quieter kind of hope. Because Waddesdon did not freeze in the role Ferdinand gave it. Dorothy de Rothschild chose preservation over private comfort. Curators chose to unlock boxes instead of leaving them to gather dust. Archivists and historians chose to tell stories that go beyond the gilded surface. Stories about servants and refugees, prejudice and endurance, miscalculations and reinventions. That shift points to something important. Inherited wealth and inherited structures do not have to repeat the same patterns forever. They can be reframed, repurposed, turned from tools of exclusion and display into tools for memory, critique, and understanding. The visitor leaves with a question Ferdinand never had to face in these terms, but we do. What kind of future are we building? One that copies this script, wealth performing legitimacy, labor staying unseen, beauty smoothing over every rough edge? Or one that takes places like Waddesdon as lessons instead of blueprints? A future that names what things cost and who pays, that tries to create beauty without exploitation, that treats resources as something to share, not simply to wall off behind stone facades and locked gates. Waddesdon cannot answer that question for us, but it can make the question impossible to ignore. The sun drops below the horizon. The house lights flicker on, electric, still dramatic, still echoing Ferdinand's old victory over literal darkness. Only now we understand what those lights fall on. Not just staged elegance, but evidence. The full, messy, morally tangled, deeply human story of what people build when they are afraid, what they sacrifice to keep it, and what remains when they are gone. That is the inheritance Waddesdon offers now, not a fantasy, a mirror. What we see in it depends entirely on how closely we are willing to look.